the books I read with Sean B. O'Kelly in sixth form especially, we had a very special class, Seamus Deane, Paddy Malarkey, Michael Cassoni and myself. Basically it was almost like a first year university seminar for, 4 or 5 days a week for a year. And the authors I read with him at that time, really very deeply lodged in terms of knowing things by heart, in terms of them staying with you. We did Wordsworth, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Thomas Hardy, and so on. So those are people that, those authors really stuck with me and I stuck with them.
Seamus Heaney went to Queen's University, Belfast at the same time as his college classmate, Seamus Deane. On completion of his degree, he taught at Queen's and Carysford College, Dublin. He has lectured in Harvard and held the prestigious chair of poetry for 5 years at Oxford. His work is translated into many languages.
Oscar Wilde once said that the only way to survive temptation was to yield to it. So here and now, I happily and gratefully yield to the temptation to believe that I am indeed the winner of a Nobel Prize. Thank you very, very much.
I remember getting T.S. Eliot one day, Kelly's class, of finally getting it, a sort of, and wanting to read in a way that made me want to read more, and getting other poets. And it was in St. Columns that I encountered Gerald Manley Hopkins, for example. And to this day, I can read Gerald Manley Hopkins and understand it, and read the Kingfisher and Glory be to God for dappled things. All that wonderful, wonderful sprung rhythm and language. And that came from St. Columns.
Eamonn McCann attended Queen's University at the same time as Phil Coulter. After working in London, where he was active in the Vietnam Solidarity campaign, he returned to help start the civil rights movement. He worked as a journalist in Dublin for Hot Press, the Sunday World, and the Sunday Tribune. His highly regarded books include War in an Irish Town and The Bloody Sunday Inquiry. Now back in the Bogside, he continues campaigning for socialism and social justice.
No matter how much you were a rebel, you were always aware that there were teachers of a certain sophistication. When you encountered these people, as I did for the subjects which were of keen interest to me, which were history and English literature and Gaelic or the Irish language, that interconnection, that reassociation, that profound engagement with them intellectually was a transformative engagement. And for me, it was very important. And I learned then to ask the question, why? Which remains the most important question, I think, for everyone.
It was a major culture shock. I discovered a whole new world. It was a relatively small area consisting of Welland Street and Nelson Street and the Bogside and Ross Street and Fawn Street and Joseph Street and Pilot Row and Eden Place and Chamberlain Street, High Street, Harvey Street. And there were a huge number of people living there. There was overcrowding, which was quite unimaginable. I'd never thought that people in Ireland lived in such conditions, where they lived in houses with 20 people living in a 4-roomed house. Houses were full of beds. You went beds, upstairs rooms, downstairs rooms, were all full of beds. People lived, reared families, cooked, washed, slept in the one room. How they did it, I don't know. It was only after I was there about a year or so that I became aware that this was not an accident, that these people were living in these situations, that this was brought about for political reasons, that people were forced to live in those situations to facilitate the continuing power and authority of one particular group in the city.
And if you've been through some columns and you went to Queen's University or whatever, and you came back to Derry, you're less likely placidly to accept being treated as a second-class citizen. I mean, you'd been to England working, you're mixing with students, you're involved in student politics and so forth. You come back to Derry and these sort of deadheads around the Unionist Party in Derry were still trying to treat you like dirt. Say, no, no, we're not having that, boy.
Education is liberation. When the first products of the 1947 Education Act emerged from universities here, Eamonn McCann, John Hume, Bernadette Devlin, Michael Farrell, all these people who were from that area could articulate the grievances of the people of that area in a way that could be understood both by the people living in the area and by the media, which were the new kids on the block, the new arrival on the scene.
The next thing, suddenly, this change of mood. Books open in the newly wired kitchens. Young heads that might have dozed a life away against the flanks of milking cows were busy paving and penciling their first causeways across the prescribed texts. The paving stones of quadrangles came next, and a grammar of imperatives, the new age of demands. They would banish the conditional forever, this generation born impervious to the triumph in our cries of De Profundis. Our faith in winning by enduring most they made anathema. Intelligences brightened and unmannerly as crowbars.
Endlessly, our people gathered their strength to face another day. And they never stopped encouraging their leaders to find the courage to resolve this situation so that our children could look to the future with a smile of hope. This is indeed their prize.
John Hume graduated from St Patrick's College, Maynooth, and returned to teach at St Colum's. He left teaching to pursue a business career. The events of 1968 involved him in the civil rights movement and politics. He was a founding member of the SDLP and its leader from 1979 until 2001. John Hume has been a Westminster MP, a European MEP, and a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly. Although criticised by many, he opened talks with Sinn Féin, which led to the peace process.
I think when we were growing up, we were very much aware of the city we lived in. We were very much aware of poverty and of unemployment and how serious it was in the city. The 1968 civil rights movement was heavily inspired by the existence of the civil rights movement in the United States, Martin Luther King. And that was a very big inspiration to us. But of course, also, I suppose, when looking back at it, it wouldn't have had the same support as it had, or leadership that it had, if it hadn't been for the transformation of the education system.
I'm embarrassed even now that I didn't rise up against it before then, but it just wasn't the thing to do at that time. We were very much touching the forelog still. It took people like Eamonn and other people to come along to shake us out of our complacency. And as Eamonn said, we decided to get us off our knees.
When the civil rights movement began, naturally, first and foremost within the search for civil rights were representatives of the 11+ generation who had achieved both the qualifying examination, the benefits of a grammar school education, and ultimately a university or third-level education. But it wasn't enough for that generation to succeed, because all of them came from a background where other people had not succeeded. And when we sought equality, we wanted all of our community to prosper.
This thing was just too profound and too unjust to allow it to be ignored. And I think one had to kind of stand up and say that this is wrong, and we support those who are trying to right this wrong.
I got a job teaching, luxurious job, People were muttering in the background, why has he done this, surrender, betrayal? But I got a job teaching in St. Columb's College, but teaching a subject I love, history. And I had already been studying Russian studies in Birmingham in England, and I had met my wife, who is Indian. She's from India. And that was a momentous year to be teaching in Derry, 68, 69, quite an extraordinary year. We returned to Derry shortly after we had got married. It was the period after what came to be called the Battle of the Bogside. And my wife, having grown up in India and then moving to the rain-swept Midlands of England, suffered from a chest complaint. And her first encounter, I remember almost on the first day of our return, was wheezing because CS gas, which was used as a riot control instrument, was thick sometimes in the air. Eventually, she had a breakdown in Derry, a health breakdown, because of the CS gas in the air. And she spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from this CS gas-related asthmatic breakdown. And that put the kibosh on it. We knew that we couldn't live in Derry in those circumstances.
Having left his teaching career, James Sharkey entered the Irish Foreign Service. After serving in Washington, D.C., he became one of the youngest Irish ambassadors ever, with postings in Australia, Scandinavia, Russia, and Japan. An historian and linguist, he has worked throughout the world for peace and reconciliation.
As that whole civil rights thing developed in 1969, and it would have been seriously uncomfortable to have had a father in the police force. And I don't think my father would have been very comfortable with that either. You know, I'm sure that would have been a very untenable position for him. Fortunately, at that stage, he was no longer a part of it.
What looks the strongest has outlived its term. The future lies with what's affirmed from under. These things that corroborated us when we dwelt under the aegis of our stealthy patron, the guardian angel of passivity, now sink a fang of menace in my shoulder. I repeat the word stricken to myself and stand bareheaded under the banked clouds, edged more and more with brassy thunderlight. I yearn for hammer blows on clinkered planks, the uncompromised report of driven thole pins. To know there is one among us who never swerved from all his instinct told him was right action, who stood his ground in the indicative, whose boat will lift when the cloudburst happens.
There were just bodies everywhere, and it was just awful, awful, awful. And I don't know how many people I'd ministered the last rites to, but they were just everywhere, and they still kept firing. And I said at that time that it was murder. I still believe it was murder.
In the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, to try to argue in Rossville Street in the Bogside where I was born, to go along there where the killings happened and try to tell people that they should seek redress for their problems through constitutional means, through the law, was just laughable. And indeed, anybody who suggested that was just laughed at. The Bloody Sunday was the definitive moment, really, when, if you like, the real trouble started, you know, sort of when it became a war.
I know of some people that it turned them from being like kind of middle of the road sort of nationalists to being turning into like terrorists by definition of some people. But that was certainly apart from being the massacre that it was, apart from being like just a horrendous injustice, the injustice was more than just the loss of the life. The injustice was what it did to the people of Derry, and the injustice was what it did to any kind of middle-of-the-road thinking. You know, it did propel huge numbers of the population into taking a harder stance and a very hard-nosed attitude. And you know what? If I'd been living in Derry, I might have been one of them.
The minority, which was previously effectively downtrodden, found through education a way to make their voice heard, and the state was so cast iron and so profoundly stupid in its repressive measures that it couldn't ever be flexible enough to accommodate even the mildest of demands. It was inevitable that there would be a vortex of violence.
In my memory, I will always see the town that I have loved so well, where our school played ball by the gas yard wall, and we laughed through the smoke and the smell. Going home in the rain, running up the dark lane, past the jail and down behind the fountain. Those were happy days in so many ways, in the town I loved so well.
I was here thinking I had the place to myself, playing da 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 da, big hit, Johnny and the Hurricanes, Red River Rock. And then in that door there came the Dean. Bad casting. Here's my career going down the tubes.
I was sneakier. I played it very slow, like a hymn. So it sounded like a hymn. It was a good
You
piece of
Strabane
music.
boys were always smarter than we Derry boys.
Did you get an extra piece of steak, Paul, for a good performance?
Very believable.
Sealed with a kiss.
We grew up in a city with its own social mores, and I think that the ethos of the city, the ethos of the street, influenced me as much as my first 3 years in St. Column's.
For St. Column's to claim, you know, that this Catholic school produced Nobel-prize winners and great poets and writers and so forth, that would be a wee bit like the medieval papacy claiming to have produced the great works of the Renaissance. I think that it was in the collision or the abrasion between the way St. Column's had seen itself on the one hand, and on the other, the expectations and the attitudes sort of people who came from places like the Bogside and from rural areas as well. I think it was that abrasion which created sparks.
The sense of being allowed into the world of learning. I think also the grief of homesickness and the growing up into independence during those 6 years I was here. The movement from sorrow to certitude of some sort was very important also.
One learned a lot of French and a lot of Latin, a lot of English and poetry and things, but at the same time you learned very little about life. But it was the only way one could have an education up to second level at that time. There weren't any other options. So you just had to grin or grimace and bear it.
I think what I learned from St. Column's about myself was the notion that, all right, you're on your own here, pal. Whatever you think, nobody else really agrees with. So whatever you think, you know, is your thing. And you either run with that and love it and nurture it and fight for it, or you kind of, you walk away from everything and you become a nobody.
I grew up in poverty. My parents couldn't have afforded to have sent me to St. Column's College. I was very, very lucky that I wasn't a year older, or I would have missed the 11 plus, and I wouldn't have been educated, because education has transformed my life, and as it does to everybody else's life.
While there were things that sort of I regret about St. Column's and that I remember not with affection, I also do recognise that St. Column's and some of the teachers in St. Column's did give me some of the qualities, I suppose, for good or ill, sort of, which have helped me along the way and made my life fuller. So I don't like to be entirely negative about St. Column's. Well, I do, but it would be wrong.
No matter how much it hurts,